What you are about to hear is not a drill. Right now, at this very moment, something is happening on the world stage that has no modern precedent, and the overwhelming majority of Americans are completely unaware of how severe it truly is. In the early hours of a Thursday night, while tens of millions of people were asleep across this country, the Trump administration executed a geopolitical maneuver that blindsided 6 of the 7 most powerful democratic nations on Earth, sent tremors through the foundations of NATO, and delivered Vladimir Putin what analysts are describing as one of the most significant financial gifts he has received since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine more than 4 years ago. And then, standing on a frost-covered military installation perched above the Arctic Circle in Norway, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped in front of the cameras and delivered a response so unvarnished, so pointed, so deliberately confrontational that it sent Washington into damage control mode almost immediately. This is not conjecture. This is not political commentary. Every single fact you're about to hear has been independently verified and confirmed through reporting by the Associated Press, Reuters, Bloomberg, CBC, Euronews, Al Jazeera, Time Magazine, and the Washington Post. If you care about where your tax dollars are actually going, if you care about what the United States looks like to the rest of the world right now, and if you care about whether a government responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people is being allowed to profit from war, then you owe it to yourself to hear every word of what follows. And before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell notification, because this is precisely the kind of story this channel was built to cover. I promise you, by the time this video ends, you will understand something that the mainstream media is barely beginning to grapple with. Let's establish the context, because without it, none of what follows makes complete sense. The world right now is navigating several interlocking crises simultaneously. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated military operations against Iran. That conflict has since escalated at a pace that has shocked even the most seasoned defense analysts, and one of its most consequential ripple effects has been the near-complete disruption of oil traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that serves as one of the single most critical energy choke points on the planet. Approximately 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply travels through that passage. When it is functioning, global energy markets breathe easy. When it is disrupted, the consequences are not gradual. They are immediate, and they are severe. Brent crude surged past $100 per barrel. Gasoline prices at American pumps have climbed week after week. The economic pressure on ordinary households has been relentless and mounting. That is the backdrop against which everything that follows must be understood. Late Thursday night, on March 13th, 2026, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent took to X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, to announce that the United States government was issuing a 30-day waiver on sanctions against Russian oil that was already loaded onto tankers and floating at sea. Read that sentence again, because the weight of it demands it. The United States, the very nation that spent years painstakingly assembling a global coalition specifically designed to punish Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine, just announced to the entire world that for the next 30 days, any buyer anywhere on the planet could purchase Russian oil from those tankers without any fear of American sanctions. Bessent characterized the decision as a temporary stabilization measure for global energy markets. He insisted publicly that it would not generate any meaningful financial benefit for the Russian state. But what actually happened in the real world told a very different story. Intelligence estimates place approximately 128 million barrels of Russian oil currently sitting aboard tankers scattered across international waters. A large portion of that volume moves through what intelligence agencies have come to call the Shadow Fleet, a loosely organized but strategically significant network of aging, poorly maintained vessels operating under obscure ownership structures, carrying fraudulent insurance documentation, and equipped, in many cases, with radar jamming technology specifically designed to evade Western sanctions enforcement. These vessels are operated through murky intermediary networks with documented ties to both Russia and, critically, to Iran. And the United States government just cleared those ships to openly sell every last barrel on the global market without consequence. Now here is where the story transforms from remarkable to explosive. Just 48 hours before Bessent's announcement, the leaders of the G7 nations, the United States, Canada, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Japan, had convened a virtual summit. And according to German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who addressed the media publicly the following morning, 6 of those 7 leaders communicated clearly and unambiguously that rolling back sanctions against Russia was the wrong course of action. 6 out of 7. The sole dissenting voice, the only government that proceeded regardless, was the United States. Sit with that for a moment. America built the sanctions architecture. America rallied its closest democratic partners around the principle that sustained economic pressure on Moscow was the only viable path toward ending the bloodshed. America told those allies repeatedly that holding the line was essential. And then, in the middle of the night, with no consultation and no consensus, the Trump administration dismantled a piece of that architecture on its own. Chancellor Merz was not subtle in his public response. Speaking before reporters at the Bardufoss military base in northern Norway, he described waking up on Friday morning to the news of what Washington had done overnight and being, in his carefully chosen phrasing, a little bit surprised. He stated explicitly that 6 of the 7 G7 members had been clearly opposed to any easing of sanctions, and that Russia should not be permitted to benefit from the current global situation. He called the decision wrong, and his was far from the only voice that said so. This is the moment where Mark Carney enters the narrative, and it is worth pausing to fully appreciate the significance of what he did. Carney had not arrived in Norway by accident. He had traveled there alongside Chancellor Merz and Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre, specifically to witness Cold Response, NATO's large-scale cold-weather military exercise taking place in the frozen terrain of northern Norway. The scale of that exercise was extraordinary. More than 32,000 troops, drawn from 14 countries, were conducting live war games across the Arctic landscape, rehearsing NATO's operational response to a potential Russian incursion into Allied territory. Canadian Special Operations Forces were embedded deep in simulated enemy territory. German mountain infantry were deploying Leopard tanks, armored snowmobiles, and drone systems across the frozen tundra. It was one of the most significant demonstrations of Allied military preparedness in years. All 3 leaders had arrived aboard an armored personnel carrier to observe the operation firsthand, and then the news of the sanctions waiver broke. Standing together at a joint press conference on that frozen base with NATO military exercises unfolding in the background as a literal backdrop, all 3 leaders publicly and deliberately distanced themselves from Washington's decision. It was Carney who delivered the sharpest, most direct statement. He said flatly that Canada's position is to maintain all existing sanctions against Russia, explicitly including the Shadow Fleet vessels transporting this oil. He then drew a direct and deliberate connection between Russia and the broader regional conflict, highlighting what he described as the deep operational cooperation between Moscow and Tehran, and noting that this cooperation has come at enormous cost to the Ukrainian people, while simultaneously posing a serious and ongoing threat to European peace and security. And then he said the sentence that reverberated across diplomatic channels around the world. When journalists asked whether G7 governments or NATO members intended to pressure President Trump into reversing the decision, Carney looked directly into the cameras and stated that every leader present has a direct line to the President of the United States, and that those lines will be used. Understand what that moment represented in the language of international diplomacy. This was not vague bureaucratic hedging. This was the head of government of America's closest geographic, cultural, and economic partner, standing on NATO soil surrounded by Allied forces, announcing publicly that he intended to call the American president and tell him directly that he had made the wrong call. In the measured and carefully calibrated theater of global diplomacy, that kind of statement represents the outermost edge of confrontational language that falls short of a formal diplomatic dispute. Norwegian Prime Minister Støre's remarks were no less pointed. He stated without qualification that the appropriate response to the current crisis is increased pressure on Russia, not reduced pressure, and that sanctions must be applied with consistency so that Moscow genuinely feels the economic consequences and is compelled to come to the negotiating table prepared to accept a ceasefire and a lasting, just peace. Norway's position on this is not simply moral, it is structural. Norway is Europe's largest supplier of natural gas. It is a significant oil producer in its own right. The re-entry of Russian crude into global energy markets on favorable terms directly erodes Norway's competitive position. When Støre says this decision is wrong, he is making an argument rooted in geopolitical reality, not just ethical principle. And then there is Ukraine, because the reaction from Kyiv may have been the most painful of all. On that same day, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky was standing in Paris beside French President Emmanuel Macron. His characterization of the sanctions waiver was stark. He called it not very logical. He warned, with the quiet gravity of someone who watches Russian missiles land on his country every single day, that lifting sanctions means Russia receives more revenue, and that more revenue means more drone strikes, more weapons, more devastation for the Ukrainian people. He estimated that this single act of sanctions relief could funnel approximately $10 billion into Russia's war economy, $10 billion directed at continuing a conflict that has already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. And what makes this calculation even more morally fraught is the reporting, confirmed across multiple major news organizations in the days immediately preceding the waiver announcement, that Russia has been sharing intelligence with Iran. Intelligence that may be actively aiding Iranian forces in targeting American military personnel operating in the Middle East. Democratic Senator Alyssa Slotkin, a former senior official at both the CIA and the Pentagon, testified in a Senate hearing that if Russia is providing assistance that results in the killing of American service members, the country has crossed a fundamental threshold, and a decisive response is required. The Trump administration's response to that threshold was to ease economic pressure on Moscow. This is not a partisan story. Republican Senator Roger Wicker, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, stated publicly that he strongly disagrees with the decision. Republican Representative Don Bacon voiced similar concerns. The criticism is bipartisan, and it is substantive. While both Republican and Democratic lawmakers expressed alarm in Washington, the reaction in Moscow was entirely different. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that they regard the American decision as an effort to stabilize global energy markets, and that, in this respect, Russian and American interests are in alignment. Read that back carefully. The official spokesperson of the Russian government announced publicly that Moscow and Washington now share aligned interests. The Wall Street Journal reported that Vladimir Putin can barely conceal his satisfaction, as the ongoing conflict in Iran continues to generate economic and geopolitical dividends for Russia. The Washington Post reported that the Kremlin is celebrating the development and hoping it serves as a gateway to further and ultimately permanent sanctions relief. But the story did not stop there. Over the weekend, the situation continued to escalate. On Sunday, March 15th, Prime Minister Carney convened in Oslo with the leaders of 5 Nordic nations, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, for what can only be described as a historic emergency summit. The explicit purpose of that gathering was to coordinate on strengthening collective defense capabilities in response to what participants described as a sharply elevated threat environment. That environment encompasses not only Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, but also the Trump administration's repeated and publicly stated interest in seizing control of Greenland. At that summit, Carney was asked directly by Danish journalists whether Canada would commit military resources to defend Greenland against the prospect of American annexation. His answer was striking. He affirmed that Canada stands behind the foundational principles of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, that the future of Greenland is a matter for the people of Greenland and of Denmark to determine for themselves, and that Canada will back those principles with concrete measures as the situation requires. Prime Minister Støre reinforced the collective message. The 6 Nordic nations standing alongside Canada are not vulnerable states. They are nations of strong values and stronger resolve. If this story matters to you, if you believe more Americans need to understand what is unfolding right now, please take a moment to hit the like button. It genuinely expands this video's reach, and that reach is the entire point. Now let us step back and examine the full architecture of what all of this means. What the world is currently witnessing is something that foreign policy professionals are labeling a rupture in the Western alliance. That word, rupture, is not rhetorical flourish. It was the precise word Mark Carney himself used when he addressed the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year. He stood at that podium and told the assembled leaders of global finance and government that the old international order is not returning, and that nostalgia for it is not a policy. He said that great powers have begun weaponizing economic integration, deploying tariffs as geopolitical leverage, and turning financial infrastructure into instruments of coercion. And in that speech, he was not referring to Russia. He was not referring to China. He was referring to the United States of America. David Sachs, a China specialist at the Council on Foreign Relations, has observed that Beijing can scarcely believe its strategic fortune, that the Trump administration appears to be doing China's geopolitical work on its behalf. In recent months, the prime ministers of Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Ireland, South Korea, Finland, and Germany have all made visits to Beijing, a pattern of diplomatic reorientation that would have been almost unimaginable just 2 years ago. Morten Andersen, an international relations scholar at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, has confirmed that Norway's strategic establishment now views the United States through much the same lens Carney described, as an increasingly unpredictable partner rather than a bedrock of reliable allied leadership. Here is the economic dimension that anchors all of this in concrete reality. Before the conflict with Iran ignited, the Western sanctions regime was actually delivering results. Russia's primary export crude blend had dropped to below $40 per barrel in December of 2025, roughly $25 below the Brent benchmark. Russia was operating at a loss. Putin was being forced to draw on domestic banks and raise internal taxes to cover both his government's obligations and his military's requirements. Oil and gas revenues had been compressed to a fraction of what Moscow needs to sustain its war machine. The economic vice that America and its allies built together was genuinely tightening around the Kremlin. Then the Iran war detonated global energy markets. Russian crude, even while nominally sanctioned, began trading above $80 per barrel. And now, with a 30-day waiver in effect, 128 million barrels of that oil can flow freely to willing buyers anywhere in the world. generating billions of dollars that will move directly into the Russian federal treasury, and from there into the production of the drones, missiles, artillery shells, and everything else Russia deploys every day against Ukraine, and potentially in support of Iranian operations targeting American forces. The International Energy Agency's 32 member countries responded unanimously, authorizing the release of 400 million barrels from national emergency petroleum reserves to arrest the price spike. The United States is contributing 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But analysts across the board have assessed that this volume is insufficient to fully offset the disruption caused by the Hormuz blockade, and that easing Russian sanctions is unlikely to meaningfully reduce gasoline prices for American consumers in any case. And what it will do, with a high degree of certainty, is substantially increase the revenue available to the Russian state. And now consider the full strategic panorama. The dimension of this story that keeps the analysts who study it most closely awake at night. For 8 decades, from the ruins of World War II to the present day, the United States has occupied the central structural position in a global alliance system of historic reach and durability. NATO, the G7, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial institutions. Every one of those architectures was constructed on a single foundational premise: that America would lead, that its commitments would hold, and that its allies could plan their own security and economic futures around the reliability of American partnership. That trust is what allowed the United States to project enormous influence across the globe, without having to deploy military force as its primary instrument. Allied nations followed Washington's lead on sanctions, on trade, on collective security, not merely because they had to, but because they believed that the American-led system functioned in their collective interest, and that America's word was worth the paper it was written on. What the world is watching unfold right now is that trust being subjected to a stress test unlike any it has faced in the post-war era. When 6 of the 7 most powerful democratic governments say do not ease sanctions on Russia, and the 7th does it unilaterally without notice, that is not a policy dispute. That is a message transmitted to every ally on Earth that Washington will act according to its own calculus, regardless of what the coalition it built actually thinks. When the leader of Canada publicly announces that he is picking up the phone to tell the American president he has made a mistake. When 5 Nordic nations convene an emergency summit whose central concern is American unpredictability, these are not minor diplomatic tremors. These are early signals of a fundamental restructuring of global relationships. For ordinary Americans, the implications are not abstract. They are tangible, and they are arriving. Elevated oil prices cascade into elevated prices for food, for transportation, for every category of goods that moves through a supply chain. The erosion of Allied burden sharing on defense means the United States either absorbs greater military costs on its own or accepts a reduced security posture. And the global perception that America is willing to allow a government actively waging a war of destruction to profit from that war, that perception corrodes something that cannot be rebuilt quickly once it deteriorates: the moral authority that has underwritten American leadership since 1945. Where does this go from here? Treasury Secretary Besson has already indicated publicly that a broader and more permanent relaxation of Russian energy sanctions may be under consideration. The 30-day waiver expires on April 11th. President Trump told a House Republican conference that the administration is waiving certain oil-related sanctions to bring prices down, and that perhaps those sanctions will never need to be reimposed, because there will be, in his words, so much peace. Meanwhile, the Allied response is moving in the opposite direction. Canada has announced new sanctions against 100 additional vessels operating in Russia's Shadow Fleet. France, Germany, and Sweden have deployed troops to Greenland. The Nordic nations are deepening cooperative defense arrangements at an accelerating pace. The President of the European Council publicly characterized the American decision as very concerning, warning explicitly that weakening sanctions expands Russia's capacity to wage war. And in Washington, members of both parties continue to apply pressure, with Republican senators describing the move as a serious and consequential mistake. We are living inside one of those rare historical inflection points whose full significance will only become legible in retrospect, but whose essential shape is already visible to those paying attention. The choice is being made this week, this month, over the next 30 days. It will carry consequences that extend across years and decades, whether Russia is ultimately held to account for what it has done, whether the alliances America built and has depended on for a generation remain structurally intact, whether the rules-based international order that has provided the framework for relative global stability for 8 decades continues to function as a meaningful organizing principle. All of that is genuinely, concretely in play right now. And that is precisely why this story deserves to be told in full, with every verified fact, every confirmed detail, every layer of context, because you deserve to understand exactly what is being done, in your name, by your government, on the world stage, If this video gave you something you didn't have before, if you believe that more Americans should be having this conversation, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to see it. I will be here covering every development as it continues to unfold. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.